Attorney General Holder, thank you so much for being here. I want to just get your reaction as the former Attorney General of the United States to a president claiming that he has such broad immunity that he could assassinate his political opponents.
Well, that argument really indicates how absurd the position is of the Trump camp. Just because a former president has filed a court paper and because we've been talking about it for, an extended period of time, I think we need to step back and understand that the assertion that he's making is absurd. It is crazy. It has no basis in the Constitution, in our precedent, no basis in law. He's just making stuff up in order to try to keep himself, out of jail. And the notion that you would give a president total immunity to do anything that he or she wanted to do is inconsistent with the American Revolution. That's what kings get to do, not presidents. And the very examples that you just talked about. If he shot somebody on Fifth Avenue under the position that he's taking, he would not be liable to prosecution. That is clearly not the way in which the founders intended for presidents or any American citizen to be viewed.
I am looking here, and we were reading through, and my wonderful producers are reading through. This is the Supreme Court filing that was made today by Donald Trump, because it should be absurd, AG Holder, but this is going to the Supreme Court that was built by Leonard Leo for very political purposes and to achieve very specific conservative ends. And the arguments that are being made by them include these five: that the president is not an officer of the United States, and because that term was not specifically used in the Constitution for the president, that Donald Trump did not engage in an insurrection, something that 179 Republicans in the Congress have signed an amicus brief agreeing that he did not engage in insurrection, that the judiciary is the only one that can enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, and they need implementing legislation to do it, that the Colorado decision violates court precedent, preventing states from prescribing their own qualifications for the presidency, and the Colorado Supreme Court's ruling violated the electors clause, which requires states to appoint their presidential electors in such manner as the legislature may direct. Do any of the arguments that I've just stated sound like something, not that a normal Supreme Court would accept, but that this Supreme Court majority would accept?
Well, they get an A for creativity. I mean, they had to set up, I'm sure, through long nights and long days to come up with those five bases for their argument. But even for this Supreme Court, with this ultra-conservative supermajority, there's just not a basis for finding in favor of the assertions that he is making. The court's legitimacy is at stake here in a way that I think really goes to, the way in which it will be viewed, that body will be viewed by the American people. To rule for the Trump camp, to say that there's any basis to those five assertions that he has made, really puts at risk how the court will be viewed by the American public. There is, again, no constitutional basis for it. There is no historical precedent for it. That is not the way in which, our nation has been formed, or for which the American Revolution was actually conducted. And I think that anybody who lines up in support of that really puts at risk our democracy and really puts at risk the notion that we are one person, one vote, that the people decide things, that no one is above the law, puts at risk the whole notion of, the rule of law.
And, the thing is, I think what a lot of people, when we talk about the January 6th insurrection, which was an insurrection, part of it was a denial of the right to vote, right? It was essentially saying that in the states where Donald Trump, the swing states where Donald Trump lost, those voters in predominantly black parts of that state are illegitimate, that their votes are illegitimate, and that Trump should be awarded the presidency despite that. It was an attempt also to misuse the Justice Department for those ends. So I want to talk about the Justice Department, which you, of course, used to run. Donald Trump is vowing to use the Justice Department, if he gets back into the White House, to prosecute and persecute his political enemies. Talk to me about the risks of his being able to actually accomplish that, because in a second term, there would be no normies left. There would be people like this guy. Let me see if I have it. This is Mike Davis. This is somebody who has claimed that he is in line to potentially be Attorney General of the United States. Here's what he's saying he would do with that job.
I will rain hell on Washington, D.C. we've talked about this, Ben. I have 5 lists ready to go, and they're growing. List number 1, we're going to fire. We're going to fire a lot of people in the executive branch and the deep state. Number 2, we're going to indict. We're going to indict Joe Biden and Hunter Biden and James Biden and every other scumball, sleazeball Biden, except for the 5-year-old granddaughter who they refused to acknowledge for 5 years until the political pressure got to Joe Biden. Number 3, we're going to deport. We're going to deport a lot of people, 10 million people and growing, anchor babies, their parents, their grandparents. We're going to put kids in cages. It's going to be glorious. We're going to detain a lot of people in the D.C. Gulag and Gitmo. And list number 5, I'm going to recommend a lot of pardons. Every January 6th defendant is going to get a pardon.
How concerned are you that that will be the kind of Department of Justice Donald Trump will run in real life if he becomes president again?
Well, I think we have to take them, at their word and take Donald Trump at his word. Whether or not that idiot becomes attorney general or not, Trump will try to put in place an attorney general who will do his bidding. But they've also learned from the first term, and it will not only be who is the attorney general. The question will also be who is the head of the criminal division in the Justice Department, who are the U.S. attorneys around the country, and what hiring authority those U.S. attorneys have, so that we will have an administration in place that will actually do the kinds of things that they tried to do in the first term, but were thwarted by career people and by people, to be fair, other political appointees who decided that they would not go against the rule of law. I think that a second Trump term, and this is something that voters really need to keep in mind when they go to the polls in November, a second Trump term would have a weaponized United States Department of Justice that would do the kinds of things that, with all due respect, that idiot just said.
And the thing is that, the attempts to weaponize the Justice Department the first time, as you said, even Bill Barr, who was in many other ways a stooge to Donald Trump and willing to, do his political bidding, it was too much for him. What do you make of the fact that we now have, a substantial part of the Republican Party that is okay with that? Because these senators, one after the other, are endorsing Donald Trump and even claiming that the attempts to do that were not an insurrection. All but, I believe, 7 of the Republican United States senators signed on to this amicus brief saying that there was no insurrection, even though they literally physically ran for their lives on January 6th, 2021.
I mean, you have to look at what it is that they're talking about. That is the Trump campaign, the former president himself, and think of the America that they're trying to create. You have a president who is beyond the reach of the law. You have a Justice Department that goes after political opponents on absolutely no basis. He's going to prosecute Joe Biden. Well, exactly for what? That's not going to bother them. You would have a United States of America that would be unrecognizable to us. That would be one that you'd see more in Putin's Russia as opposed to the United States that we've come to all know and love. And this is really what this is about. This question is about whether or not our democracy will endure, whether or not our democracy will survive. They have put the interests of one man and the views that they have that support that one man above everything else. They are happy with or comfortable with the notion of autocracy, of dictatorship, as opposed to democracy. And people say, wait a minute, now Holder's overstating the case. This is not an overstatement. You have to take them at their word and look at what it is they are proposing and the impact of the policies that they would try to put in place. American democracy could end with the election of Donald Trump. I
want to point you back to this statement, this unhinged statement that Donald Trump posted. He made a reference to the police and says that you have to basically allow for bad apples in the police department. That's the analogy he used, that you have to essentially allow police violence because you want good law enforcement. And so to do that, you just have to live with the fact that there'll be some bad apples, essentially saying some police are going to kill people and you just have to live with that. What do you make of the fact that he keeps going back to that idea of wanting police violence to be acceptable and using that as the analogy for his own administration?
Well, that's consistent with, his worldview, but that is not something the American people necessarily have to accept or should accept. The notion that there is a tension between good, respectful law enforcement and keeping the American people safe is simply not true. I mean, there is no tension between those two things. And there's no reason for us to accept the fact that some cops are going to abuse their powers. Some cops are going to be unnecessarily violent, inappropriately violent. We don't have to accept that if we want to have good law enforcement. And by the same token, we should not have to accept the fact that we want that a president should be allowed to do the kinds of things that he is in fact proposing. If you want to have a good, safe, prosperous America, you can still have a good, functioning democracy where the American people get to decide what the direction of the nation is, where everybody has the right to vote, where everybody is respected regardless of economic situation, ethnicity, race, gender, LGBTQ status. All of these things are possible in having a nation that we think that can be, as I said, prosperous and very successful. This notion of having to have, I guess, a dictator, having an authoritarian figure, to have police officers who go rogue, all of that is inconsistent with a successful America.